Welcome to Disambiguation. I'm your host, Michael Fauscette. Each week we interview experts in AI, generative AI, and business automation to help business leaders understand how to use these tools for the biggest business impact. Welcome. Our show today is the November edition of AI Pulse. You probably noticed that Tom Pringle, Director of Pilot Research, my co-host, is hanging out here with me, so that should be a good sign. And if you don't know, if you hadn't listened to one of these episodes, we are going to take a look at recent AI news and discuss their impact on business, of which there is a lot of AI news again. So.
Typically there is. It seems to be, I don't know if you've noticed, there seems to be a little bit of hype around AI at the moment.
I don't know. I mean, is it hype?
It could be.
Yeah.
Although it's funny, I appreciate, there is a lot of news, although just to kind of completely throw us off course right at the very beginning, it's entertaining, I think. There's possibly slightly less news than last 2 or 3 cycles of this show that we've done, and I'm just kind of curious to see how that kind of plays out, whether that's the odd one out, a statistical outlier, or whether it's because things are getting a bit more mature and bedded in. I don't know the answer to that, but I'm very curious to see how.
I mean, it is definitely, as we go through this, we'll see this, but it's definitely more, it's different sort of news, but then also I would say there's less drama this time around because there've been less people jumping off the ship and run into new places and all those things. So I mean, maybe that's a part of the reason we feel like there's less news because there was just less dramatic news or something. I don't know.
Quite possibly.
And also maybe here in the US, the news got all distracted with that election thing that was going on. So
I heard there was an election. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, let's just skip right on past that.
I have no say in this, so at your pleasure.
Okay. Well, so I wanted to start. I've been doing a lot of work around language models for the last few weeks, and I just published a report this week on use case driven selection of models because there's a lot of there've been a lot of development in the ideas around small model, mid model, large model, industry specific model, and then of course we had large action models when we started having agentic AI and taking action and decision intelligence. But I was just, one of the things I noticed, and I think this is interesting, and I think this starts to play out into what you're saying about where the news is focused and what's happening. All of a sudden we start to see more and more things around the models, and Microsoft launched industry specific models, which I can see a pretty good use case for it. And then Google just came up with this sort of new development in large language models that makes it act like a small language model. So and I mean, obviously we talked about this before, I think, but the reason for small models is that it uses much less, resources. It's interesting to think about this. What they called it, Relaxed Recursive Transformers, RPTs.
Yeah,
I love all these.
Rolls off the tongue, really easy.
It does, yeah. And I had to read it because I couldn't remember
it. And this industry definitely needs more acronyms. I mean, I think we can both agree on that without hesitation. Reading through this, it's really interesting. I think you're right. It's for me, there's quite possibly there's a little bit more rubber hitting the road in terms of how do we get some more out of this in a practical way. And I am not going to, and I salute you if you do, pretend that I understand really how the RPTs work. So I read through a couple of articles and I saw batch processing. I thought, gosh, batch processing. Oh, cool. My mind switches to that kind of, well, yeah, sure. It's how do you get more juice for the squeeze, right? Basically.
I mean, essentially, and then they get to come up with cool new terms like layer tying and low ranking adaptation, which, I thought was pretty cool to reduce memory and computational needs.
Absolutely. And
And
I was
even a
really
cool acronym, LORA, for the
low RA. I know that really threw me because in my head, low RA is long range WAN, LoRaWAN.
Not anymore.
So,
Not anymore. Now it's low ranking adaptation.
okay, I'll just
Well, I
make
mean, I
a
do
bit of
think
that.
whether this is the answer to that or not, but if you had a large model and you can get it to behave in different ways by adapting the technology instead of adapting the model, that is interesting, right? Because then you could selectively reduce the computational power and power consumption, computing needs, all that when you were doing certain types of things. So I mean, it's an interesting idea whether whether that catches on or not, because at the same time, we've got a bunch of other companies running in all sorts of different directions around specific types of models, right? I mean, the Microsoft launching the industry specific, and then I don't know if you saw this, but Microsoft also funded a pre-seed round for a company called Fastino that is essentially they're calling them task specific models, but what they seem to mean is small models that are contained in a very specific domain, or they're trained in a very specific
Mhm.
domain. But they're saying they can run on CPUs, which, I mean, that is one of the advantages of small models. They can run on phones or whatever. So
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you think about it in terms of, I'm pretty keen on that whole privacy topic.
mhm.
And the idea of being able to locally run,
Yep.
kind of a smaller model on your device, whatever that device, a tablet or a phone or whatever, I think makes a lot of sense. And for me, I think I said more juice for the squeeze. The idea of having a big model behave like a small model for me really is about productivity, right?
Yeah.
So am I getting more? And it feels, if it's widely applicable, like it's a win-win, on the basis that you're sort of basically using less resources, spending less money,
Yeah.
burning less power. I mean, what's not to like if it's producing, comparable or the same results?
Yeah, I mean, I think I think the idea of specialization starts to play out more when you think of the language model interacting in the context of a process or an application, right? Because then you're tailoring something in a very specific way. Like if I'm using ChatGPT to help me do some research, I need a broad, smart, generalized model, right? But if I'm using it
Mhm.
to reconcile transactions in my financial system, I don't really need that. All it needs to know is that very limited amount of knowledge around how to do that specific thing, for example.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. In the same way, I mean, for me, it starts to map to processes, right? So to your example directly, right? You think about I'm doing some desk research, I'm learning about a new topic, I've got to go lots of different places. That's a messy process in a kind of interesting way. Whereas to your point around, doing some financial conciliation or something like that
Mhm.
between some accounts or whatever, you're probably talking about fairly specific, number one, in terms of the rules as a process, but also a process that might well be different between different companies, although the accounting standards are the same, et cetera, et cetera. The way
Yeah.
that company A does it and company B does it might be different because company A deals with dollars and, I don't know, pounds, and the other company B deals with dollars and, I don't know, yen.
Yeah.
So, for me, it's that kind of map into that process.
Mhm.
And what's really interesting, and I know we've touched on this a little bit in the past, um, where I see this going, and look, who knows? Maybe I'll be wrong. I probably will be. And if I am, I will confess to being wrong. So make sure you call me out on that.
I
But
believe
I
me.
do.
I mean, me? Would I do that? I
I,
don't.
occasionally, occasionally. No, but fundamentally, I think kind of what we're looking at is kind of uh, system of models. And a system, for me, in that kind of system of models, you've got these big generalist models, and then they can call to more specific models. And what will end up happening, in just the same way that we talk about, interesting example there. We talked about running AI models on a CPU. You might dedicate GPUs or whatever. So it's about finding the right resource, and that includes the model itself, as well as the resources that model runs on, and also add on the final layer for me, which is that domain specific knowledge that's relevant. It could be, like I said, a personalized process. It could be that you need to know the accounting rules in, I don't know, country X or Y. So yeah, that's where I see it going. And if I'm wrong, I expect a strongly worded letter from you.
No, I think that more and more I've seen the idea of specificity in the model, so you're applying the right model in the right context to some job, and that makes sense to me when I think about the fact that as we move more and more of this capability into the enterprise, it has to be embedded in process, which means it has to work inside of the element of enterprise application that you are responsible for, like if you're in marketing or sales or whatever, right? You have to. So you could. There are definitely use cases inside of a function where you need a broad model, but there are also very specific situations where you just would need something that has the right, language and knowledge around very specific things. And one of the things that Fastino, this startup that's talking about the task optimized models, which is just essentially small models that are trained in a specific area. They were talking about the fact they run on premises, and I mean I've been running a local model, a small model of my MacBook for quite a while, and it works well. And then if as I looked at how it would work with IoT, you're talking edge anyway, so you can't really, like, you wouldn't want a model in the cloud. You want a model that can run on a local edge device, and that would have to be a small model, right? Because you'd never have the resources out in a factory somewhere.
Indeed, we used to talk about the cloud and the fog, and edge computing and stuff like that, and 100% right. And I think you're exactly right. Why would you want some big resource-intensive thing on the edge? And look, I'm going to rule out the possibility there might be an edge case that says you do, right? I don't know. But of course, I suppose you have to also set that against the backdrop of what we call a large model today. Given a few months probably, or a couple of years, it might not be that large anymore. It might be an even larger model.
Well, that's a fair point. Like our expectations change, over time as we develop this. And the other thing I saw with this is, I mentioned specialty models, but just moving beyond the text trained models, there are a couple of new things that are happening that I think are really interesting. And we talked about one of them last time. We talked about liquid foundation models in the last show, right? And that I love the idea of that, and it's definitely evolving, that you can have models that would actually train themselves and continue to train themselves, which is interesting. But the one that I just wrote about and have been intrigued by is something called a large behavior model.
Yeah, I saw you wrote a paper on this. I'm gonna say this. Look, number one, we've got yet another acronym going around now.
LBMs, yes.
Yeah, thank you for that. Appreciate it. It's fine. I'll just get rid of some stuff out of my memory and replace it with that. But I'm curious. You wrote the paper. Obviously, I read it, but I'm really curious. What constitutes a large behavior?
Well, so the difference is the training. So when we think of a large language model, or any language model, right, it's trained on text. Well, for the behavior model, what they did is they train it on human emotion, so that you're learning behavioral cues. And the idea, and this is where, and actually, I just sent in my prediction to CX today, and and that was, had been talking about emotional AI or empathic AI for a bit, because that's actually one of the problems in customer service, is the fact that AI is not able to tune itself to emotional cues. So you don't know if now you could do sentiment analysis using NLP, but that's not an easy part of that process, in other words. But
Yeah,
with
that'd be
the with the
a
idea,
fun thing to put
yeah,
together.
with the idea of behavioral models, you're actually giving you're giving the chatbot the capability to start to understand and be empathic in that interaction, which I could be, and I mean, this is still very early days for these,
Mm.
but that could be really powerful.
Yeah, absolutely. It's really interesting. I suppose when you talk about customer service and the whole world of CX, uh, I always get drawn to the conversation about, kind of typically people call up companies when they're really happy with them or they're really fed up with them. So
Mhm.
I do feel a level of sympathy towards these LBMs, having to listen to some of those calls. But yeah, 100%, right? So if someone calls up and they are in a not happy place because they have been let down by whatever product or service that they have been using or acquired, and the chatbot, smart chatbot, going, oh, it's all being very jolly and chit chatty and isn't kind of a little bit sort of lighthearted. That probably won't go down very well. I mean, just a guess.
No, and I mean that's definitely when it gets transferred to the human agent, and the human agent inherits something that's not in the best situation, I guess is the way to put that.
No, a bad situation potentially got made worse,
Yeah.
and we absolutely live in that world. So I think it's interesting. The kind of the training of those sorts of models will be how do you get enough of the spectrum where I'm super happy or super fed up. Do I have enough training data in the middle that allows for that bulk of, oh, okay, fine. So you're not really fed up, but you're not super happy. You're kind of in the middle. You're average.
Yeah. I mean, and the part of the idea was too that if you understood, if the model has all of these different behavioral cues to follow, to look at, that it could start to do what it does in the language model, which is predict the next the next text stream. It could start to predict what the behaviors would be based on the observed behaviors that it picks up from the interaction.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I'm sorry. I'm going to have to take a hard pivot at this point and say, so what happens when this technology is misapplied? I mean, because with predicting human behavior, what could possibly go wrong?
Yeah, I can't see anything there. Um, yeah, I mean, they're I don't know. They're risking every
Of course.
technology, I suppose, and I mean, we do know that that in the cybersecurity world, the move to much broader availability of AI and honestly, generative AI in particular, has created a new arms race in the cybersecurity space, or maybe it's made the arms race more visible in the cybersecurity space. I don't know. So, I mean, I guess that would be another tool that could be applied both in a good and a bad way.
Well, right. So it's like, kind of talking, it's the classic line, isn't it? Technology, the kind that we are talking about isn't inherently good or bad.
Yeah. Yeah.
I suppose it's simply, how it's applied. I think that's largely true. I think there's plenty of cases you could point out around the sides of that, which say, well, actually, no, that technology can only really be used for not very good things.
Yeah.
So I'll use a nice, hopefully uncontroversial example, which is one of the Batman movies where Bruce Wayne has built the giant mobile phone monitoring system. And his buddy says it's too much power for one person to have. But anyway, I don't know. I personally feel that there's kind of great potential benefit to it. But the risk of misuse, given the scale and potential impact of the outcome, could be significant.
Mm. Well, I mean, I think that's that is the the rub whenever we make, dramatic improvements or enhancements or leaps in technological capabilities. To make you feel better though, I don't know if you saw this one, but OpenAI has been leaking some reports that their new model that they've been training is not a big enough leap in capabilities, even though they've applied what has been up to this point the way that you improve the model, right? You continue to scale it by training it on more and more and more and more and more things, so it just gets bigger every time you make a new model. But apparently, this latest one isn't seeing much in incremental gain, and I even saw one report that said that in the coding side of the use case in the model, it made no improvement whatsoever.
Mm. Why do you think that is?
I think that I think we may have found a new Moore's law.
Uh-huh.
I think that there's some limitation that we've run across as we've gone into this that says this method of continuing to scale isn't going to be the way that we get large incremental gains now that we've gotten to a certain place.
Yeah.
Unless we make a change. And that's actually that goes to the liquid foundation model, or that approach, which is that's one startup's language for it, but I like it just because it's easy to remember, LFM. But I mean, all the companies are working on that approach. So something that a model that actually is self-improving versus a model that has to be trained on everything possible. And I think that's part of the problem. Even though we generate new stuff every day, there's a limitation to how relevant that is in the training process, because all that new stuff, if it's just like another thing already, it's not making the same kind of improvement.
Yeah, additive. Yeah. No, I completely agree. And I think your choice of a possible new Moore's law is excellent, not least because I was thinking about it this morning. It's the example I came up with. So I've got confirmational bias there, I suspect. Yeah, no, exactly right. So, and I think about it in terms of how do we add things and how do we scale things, and I can keep pouring processing compute into the equation probably for a very long time, right? Yeah. I can keep pouring power, storage, again, probably for a very long time. The data set, and it's funny, because of course, let's say 10, 15, between 10 and 15, no gosh, 10, 15 years there. Let's go 15, it's probably all 15 these days. When big data was first a thing, oh my goodness, what are we going to do with all this data? And now we're like, oh, hang on a second, we need more data.
Yeah.
and that's the thing that's not really scaling, right? So, our ability to sort of take this vast quantity of data and process it and do something interesting with it in this regard has kind of caught up with the scale of data. Yeah. And to your point very directly, is another, kind of cat video or, whatever, particularly going to add a great deal of value to a new model. Yeah. I mean, it might add it's diminishing returns, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. I was thinking of that analogy to big data, because that actually, when big data was the thing, and I probably was 15 years ago. I don't know. It was a while ago. I when I first started to read about it, it was really frustrating to me, because I'm like, makes no sense. Like, so I have a big pool of data. Does that matter? Because it's just random data. It's not even structured. It's just big, a bunch of unstructured stuff, until you can give it, a contextual meaning inside of something. In other words, what I used to call it was smart data. So until you can turn it into smart data, and that is actually taking it from large to small to smart, because you only need a subset of that large data to do something, right? And I wonder, I sort of think this is some way an analog to where we're looking at with the language models, right? Because we had a large language model, then we had sizes of language models, now we had small language models that are specific, and all of a sudden we now have a model that's focused on emotions and behaviors, and now we got another model that's focused on actions, and then we get a new model that is self-training. So you don't even need that large data anymore, because you've got a a model that just continues to train itself on everything that it is exposed to. I mean, it is maybe that's just the way tech works. I don't know.
Yeah, it's a fair point, right? It's a fair point. I suppose there's also subjects where, you can make the argument, I suppose, and this is getting a bit philosophical for a Friday, which is in my mind ideal. Is kind of certain subjects. How many ways can you do something before you run out of ways to do it, right? So, for example, if you say paint a picture, there's a lot of different ways you can paint a picture. But if you say, since I'm in the UK, I'm going to use the ultimate British example, make a cup of tea, there might be quite a few ways of making a cup of tea. Indeed, there are. But are there as many ways of making a cup of tea as there are ways to paint a picture? And you kind of dig into these things about processes. Some things will just be there's still different ways of doing it, but we've basically exhausted it within our understanding of what's physically possible. Whereas when it comes to more creative, bigger questions, open-ended questions, absolutely. And I think you're right. I mean, it's like the classic line here: data's data. Data's interesting. It's not particularly actionable until it becomes general information. And information requires context. It can require combinations of data. So yeah, I mean, I'm not sure I've necessarily said anything particularly intelligent.
No, I think actually. So let me add one thing, because this actually triggered something when you said the paint a picture thing, because I think this is a great analogy to make people understand this. Because if I say, if I tell the AI, make me a picture, I'm going to get something, but who knows what, right? But if I told the AI, make me a picture in the style of the blue period Picasso, I'm added a lot more context. I'm going to get a much more specific thing. Now I could continue to add context to that to get down to exactly the thing that I wanted. It should, be a beheaded woman and I don't whatever. But I mean, you could define it more. But I think that's interesting. I mean, I think you're right. I think that's the point, is getting to the context in one way or another, whether the model's the specific part or the application of it's the specific part, or whatever. Interesting.
Yeah. I mean, with you, and it's brilliant. So paint me a picture of the sea, and paint me a picture of the sea on a stormy day. Paint me a picture of the sea on a stormy day with some boats on it. And then and the list just goes on.
No, it does, and then you can add artist styles, and
exactly. So I mean, basically, what you're doing is adding variables, which is essentially creating. And I don't know, you can get really philosophical at this point, but what you're adding is you're making the request ever more detailed, creative. All the different things you can add to it, which is going to create a much more complex question. That requires, I don't know. I'm still back on the thing that, the internet's not enough data.
That is a funny shift in our narrative from a few years ago. We mentioned OpenAI in this. I saw a couple of other things about OpenAI that were interesting. I don't know that I'd necessarily call it surprising, but interesting anyway. And that one of them was that Greg Brockman, co-founder Greg Brockman, who was on a leave of absence, has returned and is back on the job, apparently.
So in the past we've talked about some departures, and being thought what that might or may not mean, and now we're talking about returns. It's cool.
Yeah, no, I guess it is, and I think that it has always appeared that Brockman and Altman were much more aligned than perhaps some of the other executives that have left. So that's pure speculation, but it does seem like that's not as surprising. Although I'm sure good news for the company to get another executive back that has been involved from the beginning. So.
Well, I think the news out of OpenAI that I found the least surprising was that they're apparently going to be launching an AI agent.
Yeah. Wow. I'm surprised. Like I thought that was just going to be Salesforce and Microsoft. Yeah. Right.
No, I totally get the whole agentic AI thing. I still don't like that term. I'm sorry, I don't know why not. It just doesn't sit particularly well with me. But
I liked autonomous agent. I think autonomous agent in my mind does portray something specific. Agentic AI, I don't know. I guess. Yeah, I'm kind of with you there, though. I mean, I've been using it because that's the term, but
sure, absolutely. Look. I've picked on words in the past and been dead wrong about kind of how they've spread. I can think of some choice examples there, but no, 100%. And it's interesting. I mean, for me, kind of the agent. We've talked about this in the past. I think there's sort of two elements to it. Which is the ability to take action, obviously, and that's the extension of artificial intelligence into action. But also, I think it has a big potential impact on user interface and experience.
Yeah.
Because I mean, the way I think about this, and it's I don't know, it's really interesting. I'd like to see where you fall on this argument. So you can hardly accuse large companies or large organizations of having really, really simple IT. I mean, generally speaking, obviously, broad strokes of the brush. Yeah. Typically, they've got loads and loads and loads of different systems. Everyone likes to talk about things like technical debt and stuff that's going to have to be updated and things that they've talked about other things. So I kind of think about it a bit like being sort of this really uneven kind of surface. And then I think about agentic AI being able to kind of connect those dots and connect to these different things and run off the different resources to do, so then it's like putting a leveling fluid on top. Now, that's a good thing on the one hand. On the other, does it allow us to sustain an ever-increasing technical debt, in certain scenarios? So it's like, well, that system we were going to update, we don't need to update it anymore. And maybe that's a good decision. I don't know. Maybe it's a bad decision. But disguising complexity by putting a shiny top on it.
I mean, we've been doing that for years, though. Let's be honest. We've been doing that for a long time. So let's be honest.
Indeed, I think that this is the next level of that trend.
Maybe, yeah. I had a couple of over the last week, actually, a couple of experiences that related to action that I thought was important. And I mentioned large action models earlier too, and that was another thing that I was looking at. But I went to a virtual conference, attended a virtual conference for Era Technologies, which is a decision intelligence startup, and doing some really, really interesting things there. And so that, to me, that use case is one of the really obvious things about moving from generating content to taking action. And to me, that's real value, right? I mean, if I can train, the model over time to do decision making for me in certain ways, certain places I trust. And then I was talking to this founder of a startup the other day. Well, actually, he did an episode in the podcast that's not out yet. It'll be out in another week or so. But
what's this?
And it's and he came up with something, though. We had a bunch of analogies for different things, but this one I thought this congealed some of the thought around this in a way I hadn't really looked at it. He started to use the term structured and unstructured around activities in the business. So his theory is that you can automate away without human oversight any of those things that are structured over time. And some are more complex than others, but you'll still, that's predictable. That's a simple, I mean, it's just RPA with AI thrown in that makes it smarter, I guess, over time. But the unstructured piece is where you've got human innovation involved, or that you need the human involved in that part of that activity, versus some of the others that you can train away.
Yeah, 100%. No, I think that's really interesting. I think it's for me, it's very close to one of the points we were making earlier, which is, kind of some processes are just super simple and pretty straightforward, and you can configure any kind of customizations, no worries at all. And others, like you say, I mean, I don't know, I think of an example of a business process which involves a large amount of human creativity.
How about making an acquisition?
There you go. That's a great example, isn't it?
Yeah.
So, kind of might well be the case that, the data doesn't necessarily support that decision. However, someone's instinct, someone's business sense, and their vision of what they are trying to create in terms of a business and what it offers says this is the deal to do. So, yeah, 100%. I like that. That's a really good example. I'm going to steal that one for later.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's almost not to use any sports metaphor, because you know me, I don't really normally do that. But the one that does sort of get to me is a hockey one, which is not relevant to anybody. But I like this one quote from Wayne Gretzky, and that is that, they ask him why was he so good at what he does, and he said that he skates where the puck's gonna be. Right. I mean, and that, to me, that's kind of what we're talking about. If I can, that's the real secret sauce there. So anyway.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. No, and I think it's really interesting. Well, we'll see. I'm curious consistently on this subject. The worry that I do have, and is a little bit, I used to say something when I was thinking about data, back to that kind of big data conversation, and a lot of my previous focus was around sort of BI and analytics, which I think is as relevant today in many ways. But anyway, making every decision on data, I used to say, but where's the love? That for me, it was a jokey way of saying, where is the human creativity? Where is the human ingenuity? Where is the I don't care that we should do this? Yeah. So, for example, I'll use this really silly, simple example. We're giving people a pay raise, and the numbers say we should give them 2.5%. Yeah, but brilliant workforce, love them. They've been brilliant this year, and I want to make sure I retain them. I'm going to give them 4%. And certain types of business would go, I just can't afford to do that, of course. But others would say we can't do that because it doesn't kind of meet our other financial KPIs.
Right.
But it might actually just be that someone wants to make that decision because they feel very strongly about how kind of business they want to run. And I think that's where you get into this kind of conversation about data, action, information, and. I do think creativity is special.
Yeah.
But I think it's, in some cases, I worry that it's at risk on the basis that there's just, you can use all the data that's available today. What you're going to do, you're going to create something that's based on the data available today.
Yeah. I mean, I think that is definitely interesting when you think of knowledge work. And I'll do a plug. This episode that we're doing right now will drop on this coming Monday, the 11th, or no, the 18th, whatever today is, 18th. But the week following is that episode that we just recorded with this startup founder that I mentioned, and that's all focused around knowledge workers and how that's going to be disrupted. So if you're interested in that topic, you should check out that episode. It's a really, really good discussion. And it is an interesting, that's obviously the place where the workforce disruption is the most obvious when you think of AI, but it's also the place where there are nuances around what that looks like. And it's I think of it like that shift in industrial revolution. You go from cottage industry to factory. That certainly displaced people. It changed things. People had to learn new skills. Some people didn't. And I think all those things are just true every time we have one of these massive shifts in the way work gets done.
Yeah. And you well know this is a pet subject of mine. It's one, and you really don't want to start me at this point in the podcast on this conversation, because I could just talk. But yeah, we all know, and we all look at the data, and you can see in terms of kind of those economic transitions between different means of production, so on and so forth. You ended up often with a lot of structural unemployment. And yes, of course, it's possible to retrain and all that kind of thing. And it's all good and well saying, we'll be creating jobs that no one's thought of yet. And there's probably some truth to that, right? Fair. But what about all those other people left behind? And if you look at any other transition, there's always people left.
There are. I mean, we have lots of examples of that, even just in the, recent past, with just shifting priorities of, moving manufacturing from one country to another where cost is the driver or whatever, right? I mean, I think that's absolutely true. And well, listen to that episode, because we do have a good discussion about it. So I'll leave it there, right? And then the one other thing, and we are starting to run along, but I wanted to bring this up because I got in that same person I was talking to. We were talking about funding, because he's is a startup, is a stealth startup that's just working on its A round, and I saw that Perplexity had just or they haven't completed the round, but they're raising a round at a $9 billion valuation, $500 million round at $9 billion. And that's staggering numbers again, right? And we we talked about that on the last show, that 40% of the money in the last 12 months from the VCs had gone into AI startups. So I guess my point is that trend, and he verified this, that there is still tremendous interest in the VC world to AI startups. So in his theory, and I'm starting to think maybe I agree, is that it's going to be a bigger percentage even next year.
Maybe. I mean, I'm wearing my little pinky ring today. Maybe I should do the kind of the Dr. Evil.
Yeah,
$1 billion, whatever it is.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, maybe. My gut says that, like so many other investments, there'll be a handful of huge winners.
Yeah.
Of course, right? So someone's going to transform something using AI in just the same way that people disrupted other traditional industries or other services. I think it'll be very interesting to see. I don't think we've got enough data to know yet. Kind of where that's going to land necessarily, on the basis that when I think about investments in sort of fairly defined problems in, I don't know, let's pick something, digital marketing, right? And you can say, I've got this new solution I want to do this thing with, and I've got to see a gap in the market and a need. I'm going to build a software as a service product for that. It sort of seems fairly straightforward. Whereas, and I'm not by any means suggesting that running a startup is at all straightforward or easy. Kudos to those who achieve it. But in terms of AI, I think that the technology is moving at such a pace as well, that we're not quite sure where this is all going to land.
Yeah.
Right.
No, and it changes so much too, right? I mean, think about what, a month ago, I certainly wasn't talking about large behavior models. I mean, that's so not only is it advancing very rapidly, but it's expanding really rapidly. The technology's base is getting broader because we're thinking of novel and different ways to apply that to do, to come up with different things. So I do believe that the investment's going to continue. The VC model, I mean, that's the part that people always have to struggle with a little bit, right? Because a VC might make 100 bets and one hit out of that is enough. and in the others, there's a variety of outcomes and exits. Some make nothing, some fail, some are small, but then there's one Facebook or Google or whatever, and that's enough to make that model work.
Indeed. And I think I use my favorite prop in these conversations. This is my pretend crystal ball.
I got it.
And I keep staring into it. You may recall I was doing a show with one of your your friends and colleagues a while back, and I've got my crystal ball out. And I look at it and I go, I have no idea.
Well, see, I think what we need to do is figure out a way to embed a language model inside your crystal ball. That's what I was thinking.
Well, I've heard all about the kind of the different processing options, and kind of how we might use light and glass. So I mean, who knows, right? And you have I'm a sucker for science fiction, kind of memory crystals in science fiction and stuff like that. So I mean, this is the future.
Maybe. I mean, who knows? All right. Well, I think we probably exhausted all the news for November.
Well, I doubt it severely, but I think probably exhausted what we've got available to us and the amount of time available.
Okay, that's fair. That's fair. So anyway, I think that's our show for this week. I'm Michael Fauscette.
I'm Tom Pringle.
Thanks for joining us for this month's AI Pulse. And that's the show for this week. Thank you all for joining. Remember to hit that subscribe button. If you enjoyed the show, please leave us a 5-star rating on YouTube or your favorite podcast platform to help others find the show. For more on AI and other software research reports, briefs, and blog posts, check out arionresearch.com. If you have AI, generative AI, or business automation expertise, either as a provider or as an end user, email your information to disambiguation@arionresearch.com, and we'll see if we can get you on as a guest. Don't forget to join us next week. Disambiguation is an Arion Research production. I'm Michael Fauscette, and this is the Disambiguation Podcast.